All right, I think we may have a few more trickle in, but it's past 6:30, so I'm going to go ahead and start. So hello, everybody, and welcome to Yōkai Banzai. My name is Emma Saito Lincoln, and I'm the Legacy Center Director at the Japanese American Service Committee located in Chicago, Illinois. On behalf of the JASC, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us tonight and express our gratitude toward our three panelists for being so generous with their time. I'd also like to thank my colleague, JJ Ue-Unten, who is helping behind the scenes to keep everything running smoothly. If you aren't familiar with our organization, JASC is a 501c3 nonprofit that was founded in 1946 to support the needs of the Japanese American community in Chicago. Rooted in the World War II legacy of forced removal and unjust incarceration, this organization has worked continuously for 75 years to foster community, preserve history, celebrate culture, and care for our elders. In addition to programming like tonight's panel, we also provide language classes for children and adults, a variety of cultural heritage classes and community events, and we offer both on-site and in-home support services for aging adults. To keep up with all of the great things happening at JASC, please sign up for our twice monthly email newsletter and follow us on social media. We know the pandemic has impacted the finances of many households, but if you are in a position to give, we hope you'll consider making a donation tonight to ensure that we can continue to fulfill our multi-pronged mission. It is through the generosity of people like you that we are able to offer programs like this for free. We'll be dropping a link in the chat to point you to the JASC donation page. Before we get started, I do have a couple of housekeeping items to go over. First, tonight's program is being recorded and it will be made available on the JASC YouTube channel as soon as possible. If you prefer not to appear in the recording, please feel free to turn off your camera. Next, we have a tremendous turnout tonight, which is wonderful, but I want to take a moment to remind everyone to please keep your microphones muted when others are speaking. The program for this evening will consist of individual introductions from each panelist, followed by a conversation between the three of them about all sorts of yokai related topics. For the last half hour of the program, we will open up the conversation for audience Q&A. We encourage you to type your questions into the chat while the panelists are conversing. And when we get to the Q&A portion of the program, you may also use the raise hand reaction to ask a question verbally. At that point, please wait to be called on before unmuting yourself. For those of you who are unfamiliar with yokai or missed the lecture with Dr. Michael Dillon Foster last month, we'll put some links to recommended resources in the chat. Finally, if you haven't had a chance to check out the awesome yokai worksheet that Cori created for us, please, please, please take a look. Jami, Cori, and Kiyoshi each contributed a creativity prompt to spark your imaginations, and we would love to see your responses online. Writing, drawing, and felting tonight while our panelists are talking is highly encouraged. Please post photos of your creations on Facebook or Instagram with the hashtag Yōkai Banzai, and also tag JASC and each of the panelists so we can see what you've shared. Now, without further ado, let me step aside so you can hear from our three incredibly talented guests. All three hail from the Chicago area, and we at JASC are so proud to count them as part of our community. We'll hear first from Kiyoshi Mino, needlefelt artist extraordinaire. A former farmer and a veteran of the US Army, Kiyoshi has taught needlefelting workshops all over the world. His pieces have been featured in T, the New York Times Style magazine, Fast Company, Cool Hunting, New York Magazine, and several international publications. Next up will be Jami Nakamura Lin, an accomplished writer whose work has appeared in the New York Times, Electric Literature, Passages North, Women's Day, and many other places. Jami has received competitive grants and fellowships in recognition of her talent, including a National Endowment for the Arts and Japan-US Friendship Commission Fellowship that enabled her to live and write in Japan for 4 months in 2016. Finally, you'll hear from Jami's sister, Cori Nakamura Lin, an illustrator and designer specializing in movement art and culture-centered storytelling. Her work has been published in the LA Times, Eater Chicago, WBEZ Curious City Chicago, and Twin Cities Daily Planet. Here at JASC, we are getting ready to launch 2 new projects that incorporate Cori's artwork. And I've had the pleasure of interviewing both Cori and her grandfather for our oral history project. So Kiyoshi, can you please get us started?
Hello. So yeah, like Emma said, I am a needlefelt sculptor. My work is focused on wildlife, in particular endangered species, because I've always loved the environment and animals, and I try to bring attention to environmental issues and encourage conservation through my work. So I just wanted to start by just showing a little bit about my work. Let me see. Can everyone see that? Okay, so these are just some pieces of mine. So basically needlefelting is just using a special needle to sculpt wool. So these are made completely out of wool, except for like a simple wire skeleton. This is the largest piece I've ever made. It's a life-size chimpanzee. Most of my pieces are quite small, but you know, there's not really many limits as far as what you can do with it. And then I just wanted to show this piece because normally, like I said, I focus on wildlife, but this is probably the closest thing that I'd ever made to like a yokai. And you're probably familiar with Miyazaki's animation work, but this is a little Totoro. And Totoro are yokai. They're not real yokai, like from Japanese Shinto mythology, but they're within that universe of his movie. They're yokai. And so, yeah, so I just wanted to start with introducing like what a yokai is. I'm sure everybody who was at Michael Dillon Foster's talk has already heard this, but the word yokai literally just means something like weird mystery. And there's basically a lot of them are just like personifications of strange phenomena in everyday life, things that can't be explained. This is one of my favorite yokai because it's exactly it shows what I mean. You'll see. It basically is just, it's called the Sune Kosuri, and what it comes from is the sort of weird, unexplained like sensation you get if you're like walking around and maybe on a trail in the woods or something, and you feel something brush against you, like maybe brush against your leg, but then you look and there's nothing there. And this is the spirit or personification of that. And literally its name means like shin rubber, or like something that rubs against your shin. So, oh, here, well, that'll be like, that's another yokai, but, and, this is not something that's unique to Japanese culture. Like in the US, something like a Sasquatch or the Mothman, that would be considered, would be totally yokai. And another aspect of yokai that really interests me is their connection with nature and with Shinto. So in Shinto belief, which is the sort of native religion of Japan, they, they believe in that everything has a spirit, like, and especially sort of sacred natural things like ancient trees and rivers, mountains, and these are called kami. And yokai, just like kami, are sort of spirits but they're more manifested in, like I said, strange, unexplained things in particular. But also, like kami, they tend to thrive in, places of, natural, like sort of untouched natural places. And there are even yokai that are animals, such as the tanuki, which are the raccoon dogs. They look just like raccoons, but they're actually canids. And just like if you're familiar with Miyazaki's movies, there's this idea of that yokai kind of disappear as nature is destroyed, and the same thing is kind of happening like with the tanuki, as they're kind of being driven out by human development and things. But that's enough for me. Jami and Cori have a lot more to say about yokai as well, so I'll give the floor to them.
Thanks so much, Kiyoshi. One moment. Let me pull up my screen. Okay. Okay. Is everything working? You can see my screen as well? Okay, great. Hi, so I'm Jami Nakamura Lin, and thank you so much, Emma. Thank you to JASC and the Legacy Center for hosting us, and for all of you for gathering with us here on Zoom today. Kiyoshi, it was wonderful to see all of your creations. I've seen some of them on Instagram, but I haven't seen all of them all together. So like they were stunning. And I like your last one of the Totoro, because I am also wearing my Totoro sweater tonight that I have knitted in honor of, our yokai talk tonight. So I've been interested in yokai probably for the past, since around 2014 or so. But I think my interest in stories and storytelling goes back to when I was a child. I was the oldest of all my sisters and my cousins. So often when we would get together with our extended family, they would be playing together outside and I would be inside reading a book or something. And I would often hear my great aunts and uncles and my grandparents telling stories around the kitchen table. And it would be about, my grandfather's time in Amachi, or my grandmother's life in Hawaii, or when it was my father's side, their time in Taiwan. And I loved hearing those stories. And I think hearing that those oral storytelling really influenced me. And I think it was also interesting because I got a lot of the family context, but not so much the historical context or political context. I knew things had happened to my family, but I didn't know necessarily how to position them with things that were happening historically. And I think that and my family and my mixed cultural context, because I'm a Yonsei of Japanese and Taiwanese and Okinawan descent, has greatly impacted my writing, the stories I was told, and the stories I tell. So here is my family, the one I grew up with, my parents and my sisters, and then Cori and me as well. And I grew up outside Chicago, and my family has deep roots in Chicagoland. And I think being a Midwestern Asian American also changes my perspective on things, rather than if I grew up in Hawaii or on in California, like some of my other cousins. And I also grew up with close connections to my Japanese American church community and with class privilege. And I think that also has shaped my understanding and the role of the stories I grew up with. So when I was growing up, I loved hearing stories, like I was saying, but I also liked being able to have stories as items. I loved reading, I loved books. My mom read me books all the time. And my grandfather also would give me stories as a physical object. So this is a story he wrote me when I was 9, and it was based on a true story that had happened to him when he was a child in the 30s of seeing something glimmering, and he thought it was obake, which is like another synonym for yokai. And he wrote a story about it called The Slough, which is where he saw this like uncanny phenomenon, and he wrote and illustrated it for me. And this grandfather was also my grandfather, who was incarcerated in Amachi. And when he was in Amachi, when he was 16, he also wrote a memoir for a school project. So he like drew the map that he did from going to his home to camp. He had his journal in there. And so I think that really became my love of stories and being able to see them as physical objects and things that could be passed down as ways of cultural and familiar preservation. And on my father's side, my Taiwanese ama, my grandma, who is pictured here with my daughter, also told us stories. And this is a scrapbook my younger sister created of my Ama's stories and her life. So because my elders spoke about the past in that way, I think that grounded me from childhood in the sense of like the rootedness of familial history and lineage and the importance of stories being passed down from one mouth to another. So I think I'm a storyteller, like I said, because of my family, but I think I'm a writer specifically because of my bipolar disorder. And here are two things from when I was 11 and 12, when I was really starting to feel like my emotions shifting. And I could tell that there was something happening to me, but I didn't really have the understanding for what it was. I just knew that I had a lot of rage within me, and I felt like I couldn't talk about it. And I felt like it was this thing that was monstrous, this thing that was in me that was other, that I couldn't identify. And the way I kind of tried to deal with that was through writing. So here I refer to like my good self and my bad self. And my bad self was the one that was angry, that felt like untamable and wild and monstrous. And when I was 18, I was diagnosed with bipolar. But before then, it just felt like there were these two parts of me, the human part and then the wild, other monstrous part. And so the writing was the way of trying to like locate myself and trying to figure out what was happening. So from the time I was young, I wanted to be a writer, and I went to graduate school for nonfiction writing. But after I graduated, I was so sick of writing about my life. And all my writing seemed really cyclical and navel-gazy and just tunneling deeper and deeper. So I pivoted instead after I graduated to writing a YA fantasy novel about Japanese mythology based in like the 17th and 19th centuries. So I did all of this research onto yokai and myths. And that's when I really started being interested in it, because I was trying to figure out what is the background and context to all these stories? And after a while, I felt like I'd hit a wall with how much research I could do here. So I applied for the Japan-US Friendship Commission Creative Artist Fellowship, which if you are an artist and interested in Japan, especially if you're Japanese, American, or Nikkei, I strongly recommend you apply for, because it funded a 4-month trip for me in Japan. And my goal there was to be able to see everything with my own eyes, to see the stories and the places things had come from. And I also wanted to see like the context of the place and the land and the places that my family had come from. So we found my great-great-grandparents' house in Ginoza in Okinawa. There was the picture of my great-great-grandparents. And then I also just followed a lot of yokai. So here is the kappa, one of my favorite yokai, who's kind of looks like turtley, monkey-ish, loves cucumbers. So here you can see I was trying to catch a kappa with a cucumber at the end of like my long fishing pole. And here is a little kappa like statue that people put cucumbers in front of as type of like an offering. And this was in Tono, Japan, which is like the cradle of Japanese folklore. But Japanese stories often end in ways we don't expect. And so did my time in Japan there. Because when I was in Japan in 2017, I got the call that my father was dying. He had terminal cancer. And I think death hides in the familiar, which is its greatest trick, similar to yokai. They hide and they come up when we're not expecting them. There's a lot of old Japanese stories of someone meeting a friend in the street and having a perfectly normal conversation. And then later they found out that the friend had died a week or a month or a year ago. And instead they had encountered like a type of yokai, a ghost who had retained its human form, and they didn't even realize it. And so during this time, I felt like my father's death was like a hammer lifted above me, just like waiting for that to happen. And I couldn't work down my novel. I didn't write for months. And then I had a miscarriage, and then I had a baby. And I was so afraid. I was so afraid for my father and for the baby. And when I began to write again, it was not about the novel, but about my life as I began to try to think about how to get through the next few months, and also how to use writing as a way to connect the lives and communities of the people and families that came before me and would come after me. So here is like my father as a child with his family, me as a child, and then my father and his mother, and my mom and my daughter. So just trying to see how like these cycles of time happen. And so the yokai, which was all this research I did for this fiction book, gave me a way to talk about my life without making me feel like I was still like tunneling inward into saying the same thing over and over again, or being so like insular. I use the yokai as a lens, as a way for me to talk about and understand fear and grief, and to not only personally, but also contextually and communally. Because I think what a society fears says so much about it. And I feel a kinship with the yokai because the rage made me feel monstrous. And I'm also interested in folklore more generally because of how stories can be utilized or co-opted by different forces, how rhetoric creates villains, and how often the only difference between what we consider history and what we consider mythology lies in who holds political power. So the book I'm writing with my sister is called The Night Parade, and it's divided into 16 chapters, and each one has a different creature or spirit as a lens. Most of them are yokai, but some of them are from Taiwanese and Chinese myth, and some of them are like the Okinawan dugong, which kind of like Kiyoshi was mentioning. The dugong is a real animal, but there's only 2 left, so it soon will pass into legend. And my writing process often happens in bed horizontally because it takes the least energy and I'm always tired. And my editing process is usually me typing up things, printing them out, and then cutting them up, and then trying to figure out how to put them back together, like in a puzzle piece. One of my essays I wrote 10 years ago, and I'm still trying to figure out what shape it's supposed to be in. And so I think similarly, my understanding of yokai will change and transform. Yokai themselves change and transform over time. And Michael Dylan Foster says, yokai begin where language ends. And they're a way to make the formless concrete and to give it a name to like the nameless things. And they give me a framework to processing inexplicable things that happen both to like my family and in the world. And lately I've been fermenting plants as a way to naturally dye yarn. As you can see, I like knitting. And my husband and I also ferment vegetables. And my hope for my writing is that it'll function in the same way, that it's something that we keep, something that's preserved, but it's still alive, and then it's waiting for the future. So thank you.
Thank you, Jami. That was wonderful. Cori, are you ready to pick up the reins?
I am. Okay, can everyone hear me and see my screen? Thanks. Okay, well, first of all, thank you everyone for coming through. I'm overwhelmed with all of the friends and family who've come out to support us. And thank you, Kiyoshi and Emma, for supporting us in this as well. Also, thank you, Jami, for covering a lot of our family history, so I don't have to talk about it. But Emma did ask us to talk a little bit about our lives and our work and process. And as I was thinking about kind of like what makes me in this moment, I just kept coming back to this like feeling of like loopage and return and like regrounding. And so I think that if you can think of like this shape move while I talk, that's kind of the space that I'm in. A lot of the stories that Jami was talking about, like we definitely knew them as a family, but I did not know them as a child. Even like the historical bits and like even where our family fits into them, like I just did not receive them in the way that Jami did. And so I grew up feeling really disconnected from a lot of the larger histories and family understanding of our family on both sides. So I was like a suburban, Pokemon loving, dweeby kid, and I was a part of a lot of close communities, but also very small and isolated ones. I was part of Church of Christ Presbyterian, which is a historically Japanese church that my grandparents were also in. I was, grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, where there was not a lot of other Asian folk and very, very few Japanese Americans. I was monolingual, so didn't learn Mandarin or Japanese, just spoke English. And I was also homeschooled. So oftentimes I was feeling, felt a little bit disconnected, but at the same time, extremely close to our family. You can see I am in the blue, and then Jami is in the pink. And yeah, some of our family members who are here today are also pictured. But yeah, so I didn't often root in our family for creating artwork. I felt oftentimes in this context where I was seeing myself through the lens and often the values of my wealthy, white, highly educated peers that, were the kids that around me in high school and college. Oftentimes I felt ashamed or disconnected and didn't have anything to root my artwork in. But then at the same time, was very close to my family and my the small Christian church community that I grew up with, and that was really intergenerational. All of our grandparents knew each other. Our parents, my parents met at this church, and even my cousins pictured here from my mom's side would come out from California to visit us at church camp, and so that was a way of kind of weaving those together, and it made me have a really strong sense of how to take care of a community, an intergenerational community, and how to pass on tradition. And then at the same time, a lot of people in my life were mixed. So we were mixed racially, ethnically, mostly Japanese in some way. You can see all my cousins on my Nakamura side. And being mixed, I think, gave me a sense of not being one thing or another, in the same way that being Asian is sometimes not totally white or Black. It's seen as being somewhere in that space between. And I think altogether, my childhood gave me a map for how to have extreme connection, but also isolation and disconnection at the same time. And that kind of dynamic is something that I push and pull from a lot in my artwork now. But yes, back to the looping. So the returning. So later in my 20s, I was radicalized by living in Minneapolis and by, the world. And I learned a lot more about my family and my community history. So just the depth and map of Japanese incarceration and how Okinawa was colonized, and the super complex history of Taiwan with Japanese colonialism as well, and how that kind of mapped onto my family. Those things all kind of helped ground me in a place of time. And it also made me realize that I was oh, the more Japanese folks that I met, the more mixed folks I met, the more Asian folks that I talked to, I was oh, a lot of us feel the sense of disconnection, especially in the Midwest. And also, as I learned more history, I was oh, this is why we feel disconnected. And a lot of these things are not just disconnection, it's actually intergenerational trauma. And kind of mapping our history against the map of wars, I felt I understand a lot of that more. And so some of the deep dives that have helped me learn a lot about this history have been with my friend and the amazing producer, Kat Nagasawa, in partnership with the Legacy Center at JASC here, who's hosting me again. But we did two big projects, one about Japanese Americans resettling to Chicago, and then also the fight for redress. And I illustrated both of those and got to learn a lot of history from that. And those were funded by the reparations that the government gave the Japanese American community as a whole. So that is another big loop of return, that they were funded by the JASC grant. So now I do feel now in my artistic and personal life, I feel so much more grounded. Coming back to Chicago has been really life-changing for me. And I'm feeling I'm moving from a much more grounded place. Being able to make art with people that I share values with, working with Nikkei Uprising and Adjust Shy, making art with a lot of the people in this room. Yeah, that a big part of my artistic goal is now to make art that moves with the cause, like moves with the community and with the people, and using a lot of the things that I've learned about, you know, having conversations as a whole, and then making, as a, like, you know, community, like what does the community need, and making art from there. And yeah, coming back to Chicago also makes me like a lot more rooted in this like intergenerational lens, like just being, you know, virtually connected to my family, and even just closer to the Japanese American community and the history here in Chicago that is really rich. It gives me, yeah, just like a sense that time is very, very connected. And I love this visual that I dreamed up with Kat, talking about the fight of Japanese Americans for redress, but kind of just because it stacks many generations together. And I feel like it kind of shows this concept of like progress, continuity, and filling in the past while looking forward in a different direction. And so to bring this back to yokai, besides just being like a really big like fantasy nerd and animal lover and like mythos nerd, there's something about like seeing things through a generational lens. And my friends at this point are very sick of hearing me talk about the river of time, which is just like what I feel like is the analogy that I use for just like how, you know, generationally we're all connected, and the things that like the past influence the future. And that seems like very simple, but when you kind of holding that space in the values and the way that we make art now, and so like in the long view, like the individuals, like our little lives kind of fade away, but the big themes and the stories and the myths really come back, and they become a lot more obvious. And yeah, I think a part of the river of time is, yeah, seeing kind of how the past and the future are the same. And so that's what I tried to explain through my my Onibaba version of myself, as kind of trying to connect that you're like, is it the past? Is it the future? I don't really know. This is, yeah, the version of me that I would like to be an elder in some way off distant, maybe post-apocalyptic future. And yeah, yokai being kind of a way of grounding that in time and space. And yeah, just a very quickly, just wanted to show you some process pictures too, that like, I have a lot of other things I could say about painting, but just like I do a lot of visual research. A lot of the stuff that comes from yokai is usually a long conversation between Jami and her research that leads me to, you know, taking photos on like biological research websites, or the historical archives of JASC or the Midwest Buddhist Temple, or my family photos to look at photos of what were Japanese people wearing at all different time periods. Yeah, that if you see that right up at the top is the pose that I made for my Onibaba self-illustration. But I think just in general, I'll close in saying that like one of my big artistic goals right now is to make my family's heirlooms. And I think that that's a way of kind of like taking myself out of like the Instagram era and like looking a little bit more generationally. So all this conversation, really excited for.
Thank you, Cori. So to bring this all back to our original theme of yokai, why don't we start with Amabie? And Kiyoshi, do you have your piece handy where you can show it to us?
So this is my interpretation of a yokai called Amabie. You can see it's kind of this like mermaid-like creature. Did you want me to talk about like what an Amabie is? So basically back in the 19th century, mid 19th century, some Japanese official was called to investigate some weird, goings on the ocean, and he saw this creature coming out of the water that he described as having long flowing hair and like color, like a glowing green and like a greenish color, with a bird like beak, kind of diamond shaped eyes, and scales all over its body, and 3 legs. So this very strange thing. And he drew this funny little picture of it. And oh, I don't have the picture, but it's easy to Google, so I'm sure somebody can find it. But it's this pretty goofy, vague illustration of it. And this thing spoke to him, gave him this prophecy that Japan was going to be, I don't know, it would prosper for a while. It would have a bountiful harvest, but then there would be a plague of some kind. And to protect everyone from the plague, it told him to draw its image and share it with everybody. And so now with the coronavirus, it's become this sort of viral thing in Japan. No, well, pun intended, I guess, but or on the internet, all these artists in Japan are sharing their own interpretations of this thing, and kind of a fun way to, fight the coronavirus, I guess. And so this is my interpretation, and my thinking behind this is just that, okay, trying to figure out, like, if this was a real creature that could, theoretically exist, like, what would it look like? And I thought, well, okay, 3 legs, that's pretty weird, but I thought, well, a seal kind of has 3 legs, and it's lives in the ocean. So I gave it kind of a seal body, and then the scales, of course, I made like fish scales, and then fins, and then the face is pretty much a puffin. You can see it's got a puffin beak and kind of puffin eyes, and then it has the weird long hair like a human. So yeah, that's where that comes from. And so I don't. Should I talk about my crazy Amabie conspiracy theory now, or is that for later?
I think you can. Before you do that, maybe can we link together the 3 of you about sort of how this all came to be, right? From our first planning meeting, and kind of exchanging with each other your work, and how you Kiyoshi decided to do an Amabie instead of what you originally thought you were going to do.
Oh, right. So originally, yeah, I was a big fan of Jami's stories that she mentioned that are going to be part of her book. Everybody should go out and read those because they're amazing. But so my original plan was I wanted to do something very connected with those stories. So I was going to make more of a humanoid yokai called the Onibaba, like you saw, but in a Japanese American context. So I was thinking, like she wrote one story that was called you gave the enemy a face, and that face was mine. And so it made me think a lot of, it goes into a lot of racism and the sort of the anti-Asian hate in response to the coronavirus, and how in the US Asian people have sort of became the face of the virus. And so I wanted to make this Japanese American woman with a no, like the classical, like no mask of a woman, but also with the sort of demon horns, like the combined with the sort of the Oni mask and the woman mask, sort of show this like evil, scary kind of mask that has been placed on Asian American women. But I scrapped that after I was working on it for about a week, and I realized it was way too ambitious. It was like a really large piece, and it would have taken me forever. So my work, I work very slowly, so I chose to just keep it simple and make something small, and hopefully maybe I can come back to doing a project similar to that in the future, but there just wasn't enough time. So yeah. I forget, what else am I supposed to talk about?
Cori and Jami, do you want to chime in a little bit about your own thoughts about Amabie and how you interpret this creature about which there's actually very little documentation? So there's a lot of room for creativity, right?
Yeah, so I think my process for writing, sometimes it comes with like the yokai first, because there's some yokai that I know I love and I want to write about. And sometimes I start writing about things that have been on my mind, or that like themes I know about. And then I kind of have to read a lot of different stories and see, which yokai seem like they are a good fit or a good match for that. And then I think after I read this story, is like when I was reading about Amabie, I was thinking about the idea of this creature coming out of the sea and being prophetic, and then also about it being passed around as like a talisman over the past year. I was seeing that the image has been passed around in 5 different continents over the past year. So I'm just going to read a little bit of like a rough draft of some of my writing about Amabie, so you can kind of see how I try to weave yokai with like things that are happening presently, and also like familial history as well. So during coronavirus, the Amabie, who had disappeared from public view, who had gone back beneath the waves since 1846, reemerged. You sent someone an image of Amabie for protection, an amulet, a prayer, or a hope made tangible. I believe in prayer, but I also believe in something you can hold in your hand to rub through your fingers as solace. In the early days of the pandemic, I did not give or receive Amabie, but I kept a plastic bin outside my yard for all the contactless exchanges with my friends and family, to leave things for others to pick up or for others to put in. This person had extra rolls of toilet paper. Be safe. That person made a batch of homemade DoubleTree cookie recipes. Be well. 50-pound bags of flour, 1 pound of yeast, the text going round and round. Who needs this? Who needs that? When infrastructure falters, there is still community. It reminded me of when my father was dying and my daughter was born, when food would arrive on our doorstep dinner after dinner, neat bundles of so men with a Tupperware of all the toppings and another Tupperware of dressing, a tater tot casserole, foil-covered trays of pasta. At that time, I called us the death house, those months when my father was dying and my sisters came home and we all lived together. Death house, no rules, we said, when we wondered if any single thing was proper or appropriate. And often, you do not know what to say to the death house. What is there often to say? Instead, these bundles of food. Be safe, be well. My grandfather recently told me that when he was in Amachi during World War II, his mother and other Issei mothers followed the tradition of creating 1,000 stitched belts of fabric for their Nisei sons who were going off to fight in the 442, the Japanese American Infantry Unit. They would pass around the fabric to other people at camp, and each person would make 1 stitch or knot on the fabric, with the goal of getting 1,000 stitches so that the person carrying it would have the strength of 1,000 men. My great-grandmother made one for my great-uncle Joe, who fought in the 442. My grandfather and his siblings all made a stitch and passed it around camp, a tangible thing to carry, the strength of your community. Be safe, be well. My Uncle Joe came home. I think of the Amabie image being reproduced and exchanged digitally and physically all over the globe, replicated over and over again. And isn't that also a type of virus, a network of things passed on, a web of safety? Yeah, so that's just like a little blip of what will probably be like the Amabie chapter in the book, but that kind of just shows like the process of how I try to think of the yokai and my own life and things that have happened in the past and the present and the future. Yeah.
Okay, now I have to try to talk while I'm crying through that, but thank you, Jami. This is the first time I've heard that too, and I really love that piece. So I have the lovely job of just illustrating whatever Jami writes. And so, yeah, we would talk about the amabie. I also didn't know about it, but I had seen it like on Instagram and stuff. And it's funny because we made this, like I have started painting the amabie after when the vaccine was being rolled out. And so we were like, oh, like I'm making the amabie, but we don't need him anymore. And now it's like, keep the Delta variant away. But this is a little bit of my process. This in the corner, you can see the very weird looking one. I copied that one from online. That's the one that Kiyoshi was referencing, that it's kind of just like a weird little mermaid figure. And I also was just trying to visualize what I wanted my version of amabie to be. I thought that the versions that were more like a fish were weird. And I wanted to do this thing that I had dreamed, which was to make all of my cousins the models for the book. So every slightly humanoid yokai there was would be based on one of our first cousins. And so that's why I decided to push this to a more humanoid version. And you could see that I based it on my cousin Leah. So the sketches from that point, then I kind of painted these little color tests. It's confusing because in this version, the painting is done, but it went from the color test in the corner to this full sketch. And then finally, in the end, I fill it in, and I am using gouache and watercolor. So this is, again, another one, a first preview look at one of the illustrations that will be printed. So I did dead fish on one side and a live fish on the other to represent this kind of part of the legend that I've heard, at least, which is that an amabie can foretell the coming of a pandemic, or can keep the pandemic away. So it could do both of those. So I wanted to share that.
Thank you, Cori. That is an awesome piece and I love it. So we have about 10 minutes left for the three-way conversation. And then we need to open up for our audience. And I know amongst yourselves, you had so many amazing topics you wanted to cover, but if you'll indulge me, I'm hoping that maybe the three of you could dive a little bit more into the aspects of this work that we're talking about, these yokai that come out of Japanese tradition and your identities as Japanese Americans and part of the Nikkei diaspora. Jami, tag, you're it.
Sorry, phone emergency. So I think one of the things that I think about constantly doing this work is like context and positionality. I think because one of the things I think about is that like I did not grow up hearing these yokai tales passed down to me orally the same way I heard like other family stories. So it's something that I came to like as an adult, and everything is like intentionally like a process of research. And I do not speak Japanese fluently, so everything is through translation or like through a research assistant. And I think thinking about yokai and how yokai so too are tied to place is trying to think of like, as yokai change and transform and adapt through time and through an environment, thinking about like how that affects us and our positions as Japanese Americans here in the United States. Like one thing Cori and I talk about a lot is like, what are the yokai that haunt our community and what would that look like and what would that be? Because I think as Japanese Americans, especially with those of us like after the legacy of incarceration and our position now, it's, you know, it's shifted and it's changed, and yokai over generations shift and change and transform as well. Like the kappa, which I talked about before, you know, creatures like that are becoming so, you know, kind of like Pokemon-ish, like very cute and very commercial. And in the beginning, they had all these different aspects, but sometimes they get flattened or there's specific aspects that we want to pull onto and ones that we want to like, you know, discard. So this kind of like process of curation. And I think for me, as a Japanese American, I want to remember that like one of the things in our book is that each of Cori's illustrations we have with markers from our own lives and our own JA community life too, to be like, this is not the one all be all image of a Rokurukubi or anything like that, because we're coming at this as using like yokai as a lens and interpreting it based on our own context as well.
Cori, do you want to add a little bit to that?
Yeah, I think what I'll add is that I think a part of what I love about yokai and feeling like it's coming from a point of reconnection is that I think it's something that Jami and I always talk about, like there is no authentic yokai. And I think that there's this myth of authenticity that I think often traps children of immigrants, of this idea of being held to the authority of the authenticity of the home country, and then anything that is like less than is just a delusion, diluting of that authentic thing. And that's something that I've talked about in my work with food that I don't think is real. Like I think that we are creating something new with the resources and stories and the plants that we have around us. And so I think that when Jami and I are talking about yokai, we're trying to often be like, yeah, what haunts our communities here? And then also like, what are the lands and stories and like the places that influence the myths that we create. I think, yeah, it's a long way of saying I think the same thing of just that, like, I think that there is a realness and there's a newness to the ghosts of the Nikkei that are connected to, but are not the same as the yokai of mainland Japan and its islands.
Kiyoshi, do you have thoughts to add from the perspective of a Shin Nikkei, right? Someone whose family didn't have that incarceration experience. So you carry, and I share that, a different type of connection and disconnection from the authentic Japan. Do you also struggle sometimes with this concept of, am I Japanese enough, or am I authentic? Can I authentically represent this culture if I was born and raised in this country?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we were talking earlier about like imposter syndrome, and I think this kind of this program like is a little bit of a metaphor for my life in a way, because like in some ways, not all aspects of my life, but yeah, like just coming into this, I was just feeling like I was raised to be pretty American, like my parents wanted me to be as normal as possible. And normal means like, well, pretty much it means white. But so I wasn't raised with a lot of my Chinese or Japanese culture. So yokai I was really only exposed to from like watching Japanese cartoons, sometimes, and reading Japanese comic books. And so coming into this, I was like, how do I pretend to be a little bit something that I'm not, as somebody who is very knowledgeable about this cultural aspect that I never really grew up with. But because like Jami and Cori, I'm really only familiar with this stuff because I'm kind of I geek out on anime and manga and stuff like that. But so I came up with, my father lives in Japan, and he is Japanese, and so I've always had a lot of Japanese family, and we visited my Japanese grandparents pretty often growing up, and so in my adult life I've been trying very hard to learn Japanese, like starting from college. And I make an effort to study a little bit every day. And so I never really get much chance to practice speaking, so my speaking sucks, but I can read a lot. I can comprehend pretty well, like listening. So I thought, oh, well, maybe I could use that for this and kind of find some information that's kind of not available in English. And so I did some digging about the amabiye in particular. And I found that there's kind of this very dark side to it that nobody really talks about, that I've never seen talked about in like American media or English media. And I guess, well, here I was going to, I made a little, I collected some slides for this, but.
And this is an awesome story that you have to share with us. And I know it's not a super brief one. So we are coming up on 7:30. So if you can keep it as concise as possible, because I don't want to cut our audience short on the chance to really engage in conversation with the three of you.
Okay, I'll try. So this is just to introduce the idea behind this. Yokai, well, they have a very dark side to them, but not only in their mythology and their actual descriptions of what they are. Like this is a what's called a tsuchigumo, but it also has a very dark background in terms of how it came to be, the idea of it, how it was created. So the tsuchigumo is a sort of abbreviation of the term tsuchigomori, which means literally somebody who digs or like hides in the dirt. And tsuchigumo just means like dirt spider. And so the sound, is similar, but it kind of, you go from tsuchigomori to tsuchigumo and you get this giant scary spider. And what tsuchigomori, the word was a racial slur for back in an ancient racial slur back in like the very beginnings of the Yamato Japan, when in the 5th century, when the Yamato people began to dominate Japan and take it over from these indigenous, very diverse indigenous cultures that had inhabited Japan. They just started wiping all of those cultures out, and they referred to those people as tsuchigumo or tsuchigomori originally, because back in those days, during these wars of elimination or genocide, basically, they were these indigenous groups would hide in the ground and make cave systems and kind of fight a guerrilla war against the Yamato, which are the modern day Wajin, or the majority of Japanese today. And so after these groups were kind of wiped out or assimilated, this sort of just evolved into this myth and a monster called the tsuchigumo. And you can see the sort of monstrous, like human-like head and the scary spider body. It really comes from this sort of human tendency to demonize the others, from outside of your group. And so it turns out the amabiye has a very similar background. So basically, the word amabiye, when you write it out in katakana, or the phonetic alphabet, and you get a word that is very similar to amabiko, and it's very easy to misspell it. So most Japanese scholars of folklore and things think that this was originally actually amabiko, and it was misspelled in the sort of announcement or news bulletin that was printed out. So it should have been amabiko, because up to this time, no one had ever heard of amabiye. It didn't exist, but there was something called the amabiko. And this is the amabiko. It was described as having 3 legs, also prophetic. It would, whenever it would appear, it would tell people there's going to be a plague, or it would prophesize good harvest. And it told people to draw its image and share it. So it's pretty much the exact same thing, but the description is different. Like normally they're described as being kind of like ape-like, having long hair, like the Amabie having long hair, but more like ape-like, and having a big nose, which I guess the idea of having like a bird-like nose would that kind of fits as well. And here's another drawing of Amabiko. So I was doing some digging in like Japanese YouTube videos, and I found this Japanese kind of yokai scholar / author that specializes in yokai and just basically occult things. And he had this amazing video basically about basically warning people not to trust the Amabie, because it actually wants to do us harm. It's actually evil. And he goes into this big, long explanation of why. But the main thing that I got out of it that was relevant was that, like he also agreed that it's actually Amabiko. There's no such thing as an Amabie. And the Amabiko, it turns out, is a figure that comes from Shinto mythology and like the Japanese origin story. So this is Amaterasu, the sun, the goddess of the sun, and she is the ancestor of the Japanese emperors, the Yamato emperors, and basically all of the Japanese people by proxy, I guess. And cultures all over throughout history have the leaders have painted themselves as divine or descended from gods, and Japanese are no different. So this is Amaterasu's great grandchildren, and there was a story, an origin myth of the Japanese people, and these two brothers. This one is named Umi Sachihiko, which literally means ocean, like blessed, ocean blessing boy. And this is Yama Sachihiko, which means like a mountain blessing boy. And these two brothers were given these magical tools by their fathers, or by their father, the god, what's his name? Ninigi. And so the Umi Sachihiko was given a magical fish hook, and he was blessed with the ability to, just catch bountiful harvests of fish. And the Yama Sachihiko was given a magical bow and arrow, and he was a master hunter who could, catch any animal. And at one point, Umi Sachihiko got jealous of his brother, and he thought that his toy was cooler, and he demanded that they switch. And so they did, and they tried it out, but both of them sucked at what the other brother was good at. And so, but like in the process of trying out this magical fish hook, Yama Sachihiko lost the fish hook, and he had to go and retrieve it from the ocean. And in the process, he got lost underwater, and he met the Dragon King Ryujin, and ended up actually marrying the Dragon King's daughter, Toyotama Hime. And the Dragon King helped him find this fish hook, and he was able, after a long time, was able to return to his home, Japan, and he met his brother again and tried to return the fish hook that he had lost, but his brother was still angry at him because his brother is painted as this total jerk, and he attacks Yama Sachihiko, but Yama Sachihiko now has the powers given to him by his father-in-law, the Dragon King, the Ryujin. He's actually the guardian dragon of the ocean. And so he uses the ocean against his brother and half drowns him, but in his great benevolence or his great goodness, spares his brother. His brother has to swear his devotion to him and swear that he will serve him from then on. So Yamasachi Hiko goes on to basically become the father of the Yamato people. All of his descendants become the emperors, and then hence the Yamato people. So that's why he's the good guy. And then the bad guy here, the jerk brother, becomes the father of all of the Hayato people. And the Hayato people were an ethnic group, a minority ethnic group from Kyushu, that were actually Austronesian. So basically related closely to modern Polynesian people. And so they had similar culture and similar genetic makeup. And so the story is that Umisachi Hiko was cursed forever and swore to be, his destiny was to be the servant of his brother forever, which basically means that these Hayato people were destined to be the servants of the Yamato people forever. And so that's kind of what happened is the emperors in that period of ancient Japan, they made the defeated Hayato enemies become the imperial servants, the ones that were left. And then eventually that culture just disappeared, became, I guess, the people probably integrated in with, the majority Japanese.
Kiyoshi,
So-
we need to wrap this up a little bit. We need to make sure that there's
okay, I'm
time
almost
for a
done.
Q&A.
Sorry. So the characters here, so Umi Sachihiko can also be pronounced Ama. The character for ocean can also be pronounced Ama or Umi. So Ama Sachihiko, which was shortened to Ama Biko. Biko is just kind of the H becomes a B when you put them together. And so Amabiko is the name of that funny ape-like yokai that I showed you. And the founder of Japanese folklore studies, Yanagita Kunio, once said that yokai are fallen kami, sort of disgraced kami. And so in this case, the idea is that this god, Umisachi Hiko, when he fell from grace, became this yokai called the Amabiko. And that you can see that in that his name is the same, Amabiko. So then when you look at this yokai, it's like this ugly, scary creature with 3 legs. It's just this weird thing, ape-like, hairy, a lot like how Japanese people, like in ancient times, just would describe like other ethnic groups, like the Ainu in Hokkaido, and probably would have described Polynesian people back then as well. So yeah, that's basically what I was getting at, is that the Amabie has this dark sort of side that is related to just this tendency, human tendency to where the powerful kind of demonize or kind of demonize their enemies, the others, and yeah, so it's related to kind of modern day US in a lot of ways, and what the US did to its indigenous people, and in Jami's story, how she talked about the demonization of Asians and Japanese throughout American history. They were called vipers. Dr. Seuss drew them during World War II as like like hordes of feral cats trying to get into the U.S., things like that. And it relates to my experience growing up in a way too. Just racism, and especially racism that I faced since the coronavirus, since the pandemic.
Yeah.
As an Asian,
And
the
I think
harassment that I've faced. And what's that?
Oh yeah, I was saying, like, I think that goes back to what we were talking about before, this idea of like how we're bringing in the yokai, kind of also like not only bringing it as like something that we look back as like these Japanese traditions of stories that keep on going, but kind of like things that we're involving in the present and like and also in the future as well. Because I think something that all three of us are really interested in is like this idea of a yokai and what we think about them, like kind of as we think of it like as the end of the world, or we're all very interested in animals and this idea that our environment is shifting so rapidly now because of climate change, and because that the flora and fauna that we grew up with are all dying out, like our grandchildren's generations won't have it, so that these creatures are kind of going to be pushed into myth, into yokai. And I know, Cori, that's something you've been talking about for a long time as well, right? Like, you're on mute.
Yeah, just wanting to see if you wanted to.
Yeah, so folks, if you're not keeping an eye on the chat, I dropped into the chat that please feel free to start putting your questions for Cori, Jami, and Kiyoshi in the chat. Or if you'd rather ask your question verbally, feel free to raise your hand, turn on your camera, turn on your mic. We'll call on folks if we start to see hands being raised. And maybe while people ruminate on their questions, Jami, I love how you posed the question to the audience about what kinds of yokai or monsters haunt them or their communities. So if anybody in the audience wants to respond to that, either in the chat or on camera, I would be fascinated to hear what kinds of responses folks have. In the meantime, while we wait for questions to come in, Kiyoshi, Jami had actually asked while you were showing your amabie, how long did it take you to make that? And I know that's a question people often ask you, is how long do your pieces take?
Oh, well, it's not even finished. So you can see here, this is sort of the finished side. And then here, I'm still working on the scales. I haven't colored them yet completely. But yeah, so it takes me a long time. I've been working on this for a month now. And I'm not even done, but I have been distracted for the past week, so I haven't been able to work on it, but yeah.
And then I think we had discussed in our meeting yesterday that if you have a needle handy and some of your wool, could you just do a really quick demo for folks so they can see the physical action of doing needle felting?
So to make the scales, or to color the scales in, so I would take some of this is wool. This actually is silk, but silk also works. And I would take a little bit of the fibers, roll it up to about the size that I want. And then if I want to, color in one of these scales here, and I just, place the bit of wool where I want it. No, just drop.
Well, you find your needle. Maybe find your needle and do a silent demo.
Well, no, I just dropped the.
While Cori and Jami tackle, I see an awesome question in here. What is the process like collaborating on a book as sisters during a pandemic, climate change, long distance, etc.?
I can go first. And yeah, watching Kiyoshi do some needle felting too. Very cool. So I think that something just like, there's a lot that can go into it. Like Jami and I can talk about our sister relationship for a very long time, but I think that it's through pandemic, through climate crisis, through virtual, I feel like a lot of it is also coming back to like, how do we have connection and disconnection, or our connections and our disconnections are all shifting. They've shifted a lot over the past few years. And also I feel like, particularly, I keep coming back to these questions of like, what does it mean to be grounded? And like, who are my people? Like, I feel like I've asked myself that many, many times. Like, who's my pod? Who are like my people? Like, what am I doing? A lot of that vibe. And being grounded in place. And like, even with these big questions of like, how do we grieve what is lost forever? I think that's something I think about with being an artist or being a person during the climate crisis a lot. Is it feels like there's just so much grief that I can't even hold, thinking about the wilds being lost. And for all these big questions, I feel like personifying something and putting a little ritual to it just makes it a little bit more tangible. And so I think things like, you know, crafting together, like collaborating together, and even, having a name for something that feels lost. I don't know if it, I feel like it's hard for me to tie things that are like our Jami and my relationship, the creative process, and thinking about the world. Because for me, those are kind of all the same thing. So I think I keep getting confused during this conversation because all of those literally feel the same at this point. Yeah, Jami, how about you?
And I think one of the things that we're lucky about is that Cori and I have been collaborating together since we were little, because we were those people who, like, from the time we were like 3, I knew I wanted to write. Cori knew she wanted to draw. So like growing up, like I would make these zines when I was like 16 and 17 that I would like send to people I met on LiveJournal or whatever. And like Cori would draw the illustrations for them. She would like draw the covers. Yes, YouTube dance videos, Erica. Like, so we've been like creating with each other for a long time, so that we kind of like know how each other works and stuff. And I think I process a lot of it as like we have a monthly standing call to go over things where Cori will show like the art and how it's going, and we check in. And every time Cori will check in and ask at the beginning, like, how are we feeling? How are we doing? And I'm like, that's something that like I would never ask. So I'm glad like she asked it. I usually like initially respond by doing like talking about work, and Cori's like, but how are we feeling? And I'm like, oh yeah, like that's important to the process too, and different than productivity. So I'm glad that we have like that personal connection to be able to do it. And it's also hard, you know, too, because then this working relationship is infiltrating everything in our family dynamics and stuff. So I think, you know, there's like definite, like, there's so many pluses to it, but it also like makes this book project kind of filter into like all our different family relationships as well. So that's something to think about. Yeah.
We have a comment from Beth, not really a question, but addressing this issue of deceased family members haunting us. And, you know, maybe that's not yokai, but a manifestation of grief in the way that, Cori, you were talking about putting a name to something or giving it shape can help us process that grief. And
yeah, and I think that's one of the things that drew me to yokai initially, is because it's so much of like relating to like of Shintoism and this idea of like ritual. And I think rituals for the dead, when we think of like things like Obon, like festival every summer, and this idea of having tangible, and I think this goes back to Amabie, of like tangible things, of having ritual, because in Japan, so much of it is like ritual, like of like the religious process and having things to do. Like, and I have a little space on my bookshelf over here, which is like that I keep things that have to do with my dad. I know Cori has like a little altar space too. And like my mama growing up like had one for my agong, and now for my father. And so I think like just having like these like little spaces, and I think yokai are so tied to place, you know, and like Yurei, the ghost, would like haunt a specific place, and they would keep coming back to that place, or they would be stuck in that place. So like that idea of having a space for this grief, whether it be physical, whether it be in illustration or in books, as like a location to carry that grief with you, I think, as we're all grieving in different ways during coronavirus, I think is helpful.
Yeah, and Cori, what you were saying about the loss of the wild, I know, Kiyoshi, that connects a lot to what you do in your regular art, not your new yokai art. But do you want to say a little bit about what drives you to make the animals that you make and choosing often endangered species? You're muted.
Yeah, basically, like I said, I have always loved nature, and for a long time, you know, just seeing the destruction that man has caused to nature in general, and species of all kinds of wild animals. And so I don't know, I just feel like I want to do something, since I have a talent for art, and you know, I feel like I should use it for that. One of the things I'm trying to do is I'm working with a group in Chile, that is trying to save the Andean mountain cat. And I made kind of a life-size Andean mountain cat for them as like a mascot for their organization that they could bring to conferences and stuff. And one of the things that they do, I guess one of the reasons I met them while I was in Chile was that they teach local women, a lot of them like indigenous women from the Andes, the where the Andean mountain cat habitat is. You know, they teach them to make crafts and things that they can sell, show them that they can benefit from the Andean mountain cat being there instead of killing it for, you know, to protect their livestock or something, or hunting for their coats. And one of the things that they happened to be teaching them even before they met me was needlefelting, and so they were making little like needlefelted Indian mountain cats. And so before the pandemic happened, I was supposed to go to Chile and teach some of these women in these villages, but that got canceled. So hopefully that can happen again.
So I'm seeing one final question for Cori and Jami, and can one of you tackle the question from Sherrick in like 2 minutes, and then we can wrap things up?
Yeah, I can say that feeling connected to yokai specifically was a lot of realizing that a lot of things from my childhood were actually yokai. Things that I did not know were yokai, like things from Miyazaki movies, or like I loved like Usagi Yojimbo, the comic book as a kid. And those were all things that I had kind of forgotten growing up, because everyone else kind of like, I didn't talk about them with a lot of people, you know, until Miyazaki became really popular. But then later being like, oh, all those like little mysteries as that I knew as a child were all actually yokai. So it was more of a reconnection, Sherrick.
And I see, Jami, you're just giving you a shout out about your sweater, which I also applaud that amazing sweater that you're wearing. So we're coming up on 8 o'clock. So I'm afraid we have to bring this fantastic conversation to a close. But before we do that, I want to take a moment to acknowledge how challenging it can be to make a living as a creative person. And I know this because I'm married to a creative person who's participating in this call. And so in addition to asking our audience to consider making a donation to JASC, I also want to make sure that we communicate the best ways to support each of you in what you do. So could we just really quickly go through each one of you and share what kind of support from the audience would mean the most to you? Cori.
So I told Emma that, yeah, I have an Etsy that I think JJ has the link for, where you could buy my artwork. I have a Baki Kujira print and a lot of food art, but also that you could support me. The best way would be supporting my friends and comrades, Nikkei Uprising. A lot of people who are on the call right now, a group of Japanese American people. We've recently changed our logo to be an Oni, and you can find us on Instagram. We would love your support.
And I think for me, our book is coming out in 2023, so it won't be ready for pre-order or anything until 2022. But our book is The Night Parade, and it will be coming out from Custom House HarperCollins in 2023. So 2 years from now, if you can buy our book or recommend it or order it from your library, that'd be great. You can also find my writing available on my website, JamiNakamuraLin.com. And if you can follow me on like Twitter or Instagram, and those links will go out to that way you can find out more about what we're doing, process and stuff like that. And also I'm sending out the link for the Japan-US Friendship Commission, because I think often, it's important for us to be able to know about grant opportunities and things like that. And that really helped me. So if you're a J or Nikkei artist or other artists interested in Japan, that's a great opportunity in the future.
For me, you can follow me on Instagram, Kiyoshi Mino Felt. And I have a few online video tutorials that you can purchase if you're interested in really getting into needlefelting and doing more sort of advanced things. One is a cheetah, another is a sparrow, which is you can use generally for birds, and they're on curiousmondo.com, and also livingfelt.com, so you can find them.
Folks, if you are scrambling to try and jot down all these links, do not worry. We'll make sure that an email goes out after. It might not be till tomorrow or maybe early next week, but I will summarize all of these resources that are being mentioned and listed throughout tonight's talk, so that you don't have to worry about remembering what it was called or what the link was. So thank you all so much, and thank you to everyone watching tonight. As I said, we'll send out an email after, and as soon as the recording is up on YouTube, I'll notify everyone. I hope to see all of you at more JASC events in the future, especially those of you who were new to JASC and maybe weren't aware that our organization exists. Cori, Jami, Kiyoshi, thank you. Thanks to all your supporters who joined us tonight. This has really been an incredible conversation. So thanks.
Thanks, friends.
So much, Emma, for having us. Thank you.
Everyone,
Have a great night.
Good night, everyone.
We would love to see if you draw or write or needlefelt anything to see your stuff. So please.
Yes, hashtag Yōkai Banzai. And I'm seeing lots of thank yous rolling in on the chat.